Hello writers, come write with me. My name is Mykela Greenwood. I create worlds for mind adventures. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Write with Mykela. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell so you can go on this journey with me. Before we start today's video, I want to remind you that Nano Wrimo started on Wednesday, and today is the third day. So leave a comment below on the word count you have so far. If you haven't written for today, then just leave your word count for November 1st and November 2nd. Now, today is Friday, which is story time, or the day of our chapter exchange. If you're writing with me and you wish to exchange chapters, then send your chapter with written permission to WritewithMykela@gmail.com. I will post the email address at the end of the video. I'm looking forward to reading your chapters, even if I can't read them all on the channel. I'm really looking forward to it. All chapters read on Fridays, whether they are mine or another writer's work, are copyright protected material, and no one may use any part in writing their own stories. This story is also PG-13, so if you are under 13 years of age, you need parental guidance. This story is in its rough draft stage, just as the last story we heard. The title of this story is Tajiia, and today we are reading chapter 13. If you would like to read along, then send to the email I stated above or I stated earlier and request a PDF of the chapter. Make sure you are specific about either City of the Ancients or Tajiia and which chapter. Now let's start. Tajiia, chapter 13. More escapees, more animals. In the 4 villages where witches, warlocks, and a few wizards had left, the huntsmen and handlers were down to half. Many more witches and warlocks peeked out of their curtains, and they too wanted to leave. For those in Tajiia's village and the village to the west of her village, heading to the northern mountains made sense, even though they were following behind soldiers and possibly handlers and their dogs. Most people didn't know or realize that huntsmen and handlers with their dogs left behind the missing people because they didn't count them. They just stayed indoors. A few witches and warlocks thought for once there would be some of their kind on both sides of the king's men. But they didn't think on that long because they still didn't think it would be an advantage. The witches and warlocks from the other 2 villages would have an easier time to reach the mountains in the west, but they felt that was too close to the castle. Moreover, the mountains in the west, the south, and the east didn't have the same protections as the mountains in the north, especially now that they had so few in their community left. After they lost so many people, they started combining their meetings, and the meeting tree would be in different woods. But that meant they let some protections go in the other mountains so they could concentrate all their protections in the one mountain. They whispered among their own family what they should do. Several families decided that they didn't want to sit and wait for death. They felt once the protections on the village ended or lifted, which was almost certain, with all the soldiers heading to kill their kind, and especially the person who set up the protections, then the king would kill all villagers, not just witches and warlocks. So a way to protect the innocent people was for them to leave. Then maybe the king would think the villagers left were not witches nor warlocks. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a thought. The other question was, what made the huntsmen and handlers and dogs fall asleep last night? Would that happen again? Many hoped it would, and they decided they would be ready this time when and if the opportunity presented itself. A couple hours before midnight, Tajiia received this thought. Should the huntsmen, handlers, and dogs sleep again? Tajiia sat up and thought, of course they should sleep again. Then suddenly Tajiia thought that this was something more than she thought before, and she immediately looked over at Tokrel, who she thought of as the chicken woman. She immediately knew that the woman had cast a sleeping spell. So she thought to the thought, all of the soldiers, huntsmen, handlers, and dogs should sleep. And they should sleep soundly well into the morning. Tajiia received, my reach doesn't cover all the soldiers, huntsmen, handlers, and dogs. But your wish will be carried out in all the villages. Tajiia instantly thought more witches, warlocks, and whatever wizards could escape. But then she didn't know what repercussions there would be for any of them, or any of them if they did escape. She also didn't know the repercussions for those that stayed. Tajiia turned to Artur and saw that he was looking at her. Tajiia thought to Artur, if our people in the villages had a chance to escape tonight too, should we contact them and advise them? She held up her arm with the bracelet. Artur glanced around at all the people who had added to their group. He also thought about those that had chosen to go on to the mountain. Some that chose to go on knew how to set up certain protections. He had received thoughts about Thessler betraying, but he didn't think that was the case with Thessler. But it very well could be the case with others. He felt it might be better to fight some soldiers and have a victory first before bringing too many in. Victory would help ensure loyalty. But should he advise people to leave a village? The paranoid king was too unpredictable. Finally, Artur thought to her, if you wish to tell the queens what chance they have, then tell them. What is their chance, anyway? The huntsmen, handlers, and dogs in the villages will sleep into the morning, thought Tajiia. Artur thought a minute. Then he thought to her, just think that to the queens. Don't think anything about escape. Let them decide how to use the information. Excuse me. Tajiia took off her bracelet and started opening connections to the different queens. Soon her mother and Arshwea were beside her to help her in any way they could, which mostly was with the names of queens. Chancellor Wadkarl joined the circle, and he gave the names of other chancellors. Queens peeked out of their curtains in several villages, and indeed it did seem like the dogs, handlers, and huntsmen were sleeping. Now they needed to decide what to do. Most of them sighed. Their mountains were several days away, but if they decided to stay and attack, how would the protections interpret that? Would the protection do unto them whatever they did to the king's men? A couple of queens decided to go to one of the stones and read the protections. Phaedra carefully slipped out of her home. Her husband Fanel was in the door and looking left and right. He would warn her if he could. Phaedra ignited a small flame in the oil lamp she carried. The light might wake a huntsman, handler, or a dog, but it wouldn't be good to step on one of them either. Excuse me. Phaedra received these thoughts. Some of our witches are following you. Phaedra looked back, and several witches were streaming to her. She slightly raised the lamp for a few minutes, and then turned back to her path. In all, 12 witches followed her to the stone, and they all gathered around it. They all realized this was a good opportunity to read the protections themselves. But a few witches whispered, "What's up?" Phaedra whispered, Someone has the Grand Queen's bracelet, and that person communicated to me that the huntsmen, handlers, and dogs in the village would sleep tonight well into the morning. Now, I don't know how late into the morning that is, and I don't think any beyond the villages are necessarily sleeping. So do you think we have a new Grand Queen? Asked Lilsha. Phaedra moved a little around the stone as she held up the lantern. I don't know what to think exactly. The animals have been talking a lot lately. If I had gone to the last meeting, I might know more, but the meeting was so far from us. Also, some animals said that many witches, warlocks, and I think 2 wizards didn't make it back home. The animals said the soldiers were pursuing them. Phaedra eased down to sit on the ground. I don't know how the soldiers haven't rounded them up yet. She looked at Lilsha. You asked about a new Grand Queen, and I think our people have found the person. But she would be young. Who knows how close she would be to taking Queen tests, much less a Grand Queen test. Don't you need to be there when she tests? Asked Kaima. Well, yes and no, replied Phaedra. I have never tested above Arshwea, so probably not. But if I want to see the test myself, then I should be there. However, I can ask for my own test any time. So either the chancellors will record or the tree will remember. Do you think this person is someone who didn't make it home? Asked Lilsha. Phaedra turned to her. Now, that is a good question. More lights entered the circle, and the witches jumped and turned back. You are not the only one that talks to animals, dear, said Fennel. I talked to a squirrel, who said Raisler went back for her. Her name is Tajiia, and Raisler is her mentor. The squirrel said some bizarre things, like Raisler was only 1 mentor, and Tajiia was supposed to have 7. Then the squirrel said 9, and then 12. Phaedra looked up at her husband. No one has ever had more than 1. That's what I told the squirrel, replied Fennel. He said Tajiia didn't need a magic mentor, but she needed people to tell her about us and how we do things. The squirrel said, in fact, she passed her mentor test. But when our people asked the tree to match mentors and mentees, the tree did not pick her as a mentor. So, do you think she is the reason the soldiers haven't captured or killed all of them? Asked Phaedra. How many people didn't make it home? I'm not sure to either question, stated Fennel. He motioned around to the group. We are all here. We are all ready to go. The warlocks packed for the witches, while you went ahead and read. Now, I ask you to use your bracelet and see how we ride a bird to our new queen to be. Ride a bird? Asked Phaedra. She stopped herself before she said more. Then she said, prophecy books, witch books, warlock books. Do we have everything? Fennel removed the bag from his back. You are welcome to check. Phaedra removed her bracelet and tried to contact Tajiia. She felt she could now that Tajiia had contacted her, and now that she knew Tahia's name. Tajiia sat up and removed her bracelet, as many people instantly formed a circle around her. Tajiia felt like they weren't sleeping well on the plains. She found the pearl that was vibrating and opened up the water basin. Tajiia said to the water, I have a group here listening with me. Please repeat what you said. Most of the group around Tajiia leaned closer, except Autor. He was content to guess the name based on the voice. I too have a group around me. We are at the protection stone to the south of our village, and we want to know how to ride a bird to get to you or your location. Tajiia glanced around her group. Go ahead, dear, stated Akel. These are your people. Well, The only birds available right now would be owls or bats, replied Tajiia. Tajiia, started Artur. This witch is Phaedra. She has many witches who can write. Yes, started Tharkek. So start teaching numbers and then the small spell. They should know how to float up into the trees. And invisibility, added Chancellor Whitecart. I like this plan, stated Arshwaya. They can take turns saying the spells, and they can spread it over others until we can get someone there to help them ride the birds. We just need to know if they want to come to us here on the plains where the soldiers are, or if they want to go to the mountains to prepare, put in Artur. Since it seems that several are participating, I'm going to jump in and ask a few questions, stated Fennel. How have you managed to survive so far with the soldiers pursuing you? Are you still on the plains? I heard 5 were... Well, the squirrel said, eaten by dogs. On and on. I have questions. The squirrel has said some really unbelievable things. Ah, Fennel, stated Artur. If I told you, you still would not believe. I myself visited the rabbits in their home, and one of the rabbits is still with us. Do I believe that I visited the rabbits in their home? Do I believe that I shrank down to walk through their tunnels? No, I do not. But I look at the rabbit to confirm things. But I swear to you, we were on the plains, and the dogs had our scent. The dogs were coming for us. But we just shrank down and entered a rabbit hole. If I may interrupt here, stated Arshwaya, there are a lot of words to learn. The spells have the sands of time in them with grains of sand to measure or limit the time. We will leave Tajiia to teach you, and you can start that. We will see if we can find some birds to ride to get you in the morning. Started Tharkek. I would like to teach this time, with Tajiia staying here and overseeing my teaching, and then I will be one to ride a bird to you. I think I missed something, stated Phaedra. The huntsmen, kennelers, and dogs will be awake in the morning. Tharkek explained things again, as the rest of the circle drifted off to try to sleep once more. Tajiia didn't say anything during the lesson until someone asked about the grains of sand. Tajiia then explained that there were 6 grains of sand per second in an hourglass. Then Tharkek continued. After Tharkek gave the lessons and several witches wrote things down the best they could, the group with Phaedra used their spells to float up into the trees. Then several worked a small spell and spread it over others in their group. They didn't try invisibility yet. Phaedra couldn't believe they were going to sit in the tree and wait for dawn. It almost seemed better to go back home and use the spell at dawn to become small and invisible and to float up to the tree. But Fennel pressed these thoughts into her. That may make more sense, as does sleeping through the rest of the night. But many of our group are too scared to go back into the village now that we are out. Phaedra nodded her head and went along with the plan. After Tajiia finished with Phaedra's group, another couple of queens contacted her, and they went through the same thing, except someone else taught instead of Tharkek. In the middle, a couple more queens joined, and after they finished, 3 more queens contacted Tajiia. Arshwaya came over and asked permission to use the bracelet to continue the meeting to let Tajiia sleep. Tajiia agreed. In the morning, Chancellor Whitecart asked Tajiia to talk to 15 birds. He told her that they had spoken to someone in all the villages, including Tajiia's village. No, they weren't all queens, but the queens had connections to their mentees. He handed Tajiia her bracelet, and he showed her his bracelet, We talked to all the chancellors, too. Tajiia just nodded her head. She still felt very tired, but knew that the people in her group wanted to be inside the mountains. Then she thought she needed to get to the mountains to get the herbs for the witches. She noticed that they were dragging behind a bit yesterday, and they weren't working as many spells as some of the others. Tajiia stood and started walking. Soon she had the air wall over them in a dome shape. Not too much longer, she heard the sound of an elephant, and she looked over at Waggler. He was trying the elephant once more. Tajiia realized that Waggler thought bigger was better, and if he knew of an even bigger animal, he would change to that instead. Shaful pulled out her drawing and quickly sketched a rough outline of the elephant. She would fill in more details as she was able. The commanders roused everyone and told them to eat rations as they marched north. The dogs wanted food too, but they couldn't talk and ask for food, so they barked and barked until some of the soldiers kicked dirt at them. Then suddenly, the time on the spell ran out, and the dogs returned to their normal form, and many became angry and charged the fellow soldier who had kicked dirt at them. The commanders didn't know what to do with the fighting soldiers, so they just shouted commands to line up and march. Other soldiers didn't know if they should line up or try to separate the fighting soldiers, but decided it was safer to just line up and let the commanders handle those fighting. Near noon, Tajiia's group wanted to be in the mountains, but they still had over a day to walk to get there. Tajiia, drop the invisibility, please, said someone in the group. I want to be a bird. Me too, said Shaful. I watched the birds you called this morning. But you're the one that draws everything, said one of the warlocks. Ator held up a finger. Oh, yes, but she knows how to set up many things in the mountains, and she can do the eye spell to look around corners. Tajiia looked at Shaful. Shaful demonstrated. Then Chancellor Mykela teased. That will be your next test, Tajiia. But that's not started another chancellor. Then he stopped and didn't say anything else. Tajiia looked at Chancellor Mykela and saw he was smiling. So she smiled at Bollock and said, Okay, but doesn't Bollock take tests ahead of me? What? Exclaimed Bollock. Wait, said Ozzy. Then Ozzy and Ola said together, We know the word for eye. Ois. Tajiia shook her head, and Shaful said, That was sight. Just oi, put in Arshwea. Ozzy looked to Shaful. What words do you say? She glanced at Tajiia and then back at Shaful. Shaful gave the human first. Extend my eye so I can see far. Then she glanced at Tajiia. Sands of time, a number, and grains temporarily extend my eye so I can see far, and she glanced at Arthur, and around corners. All the witches looked at her. Shaful laughed a little nervously as she briefly covered her mouth with her hand. Well, I usually just say the first 8 words, but I'm upgrading my spell. And I usually only have the intention of around corners, but I might add those words. Arthur said, I think you've given them enough words, so let's see who can do the spell now. Ozzy and Ala pulled out their books and started flipping through the pages. Tajiia watched them for a few minutes, and she also looked at Bollock. Then she turned to Chancellor Mykela and asked, What exactly are the rules for this test? To see far or to extend my eye? Everyone glanced around, and the question in their minds was, how would anyone know if someone saw far or farther? Waggler raised his hand. I know. I will run to where there's no air wall, and I will change into an animal. And those that extend their eye can tell you what I become. Tajiia smiled and said, I could read your thoughts to know without seeing anything. Several laughed. Chancellor Wyckoff said, "But no, I think it is a good idea, and there's a rule. You can't read the thoughts to determine the animal." Then he said to Wagler, "No elephants or elephantonin, because too many will guess that anyway." Wagler started running away. Then he turned back and ran to Shaful. "I need to see your drawings." Several leaned in to see the drawings. Tajiia raised her eyebrows because she realized that Shaful had wanted to talk to her about the labels, but she had used her books and already labeled several. Of course, Tajiia didn't agree with some of the labels, but she remembered what her mother said, to let them try. Wagler picked one and said the word in his mind several times, and then he ran off again. Ozzy and Allah had worked together to try to find the words they needed. There were no human words in the witch books. It was all in witch. So they weren't sure if they were picking the right words or not. Both had started their own dictionaries and had written down all Tajiia had taught them. Although Tajiia didn't extend her eye, she said a spell so that she could see the girls' pages. Then she said aloud to the group, "If you don't know the words, then listen to the wind." She motioned around herself. "It will tell you the words you need. If you can't hear the wind speak, then to read your witch books, use Eg venu les sur la vai idi elf chasionix idi. Or to read the human you've written, use Eg venu les sur chasionix idi elf lavai idi." She paused for a moment and then looked at Shaful. "The wind told me to use Vaithin instead of Vait." Tokrel had hastily written the words Tajiia spoke. Then she wrote the words in human that Shaful had first spoken, and not the phrase with the sands of time and temporary. She said the first phrase that Tajiia said inaudibly, and she saw the translations of Tajiia's words. She hadn't used sands of time, so the words went back to normal, back to what she had written. Then she said the second phrase, and saw the words Shaful spoke in the witch language. She quickly memorized them. Barent was looking over her shoulder, and he did the same thing as Tokrel had done. Then they both said the spell, and their eye extended. "Don't tell anyone what you see," stated Chancellor Wyckoff, "not even your mentor or queen, because everyone needs this test." He looked around and saw the Chancellor's question. So he responded, "We don't have time to get to the tree and then test. We walk and test now. Chancellors are responsible for their groups." Balak watched as several people extended their eyes, even Ozzy and Allah. Then he looked at Tajiia. He saw her extend her eye, and then it shrank back in. He noticed that Tajiia had a strange look on her face. Then Tajiia shook her head and shuddered. That's when Balak realized that Tajiia would do the far or farther spell without extending her eye. So he turned to Chancellor Wyckoff and said, "What did you decide the rule was? To extend your eye or to see farther?" He glanced at Tajiia and then Varen and then Artur. He turned to Tajiia. "Is there a warning for far rather than farther?" Everyone paused and looked at Tajiia. "Well," started Tajiia, "I can see fairly far, or at least I think I can for a human. I've met people who can't see far at all, or at least not as far as me. So I want the comparative word." "Is that a human word?" Balak nodded his head. "Yes, I understand it." "I want the comparative word," stated Tajiia. "That way I'm comparing to my normal, and I don't have to set up the concept of what far means to me." Shaful raised her eyebrows. Tokrel marked out far and wrote in farther on her paper. Then she showed her paper to Ozzy and Alla. Here, without you, I might not have the 2 phrases, so you can copy those. Ozzy and Alla both gratefully took the paper and copied the 2 phrases in their dictionaries. As they were handing the page back to Tokrel, several others asked to copy it. We do need to keep moving, put in Artur. Yes, but if you saw Waggler change forms, then quickly write that on a small piece of paper. Then fold your paper and put your name on it and hand it in, added Chancellor Wyckolt. I really don't like your test, stated Tajiia. I could use the spell to read someone else's page. Chancellor Wyckolt sighed. Chancellor Adjutant said, then of course everyone has to say the spell of truth over his or her page, and we will feel how you gained your knowledge. Tajiia looked at her mother, and her mother leaned over and whispered the words she said for the spell of truth. And then Arshweya leaned in and told her she could use whatever words so long as the paper held the truth of how she received her answer. Tajiia took out paper and said a spell. Then she folded her paper and her name inscribed itself on the outside. She handed her paper to Chancellor Wyckolt. Chancellor Wyckolt read the page, and then he looked up and said, Oh my, that isn't good. Someone should tell him. He looked at Tajiia. Are you sure, dear? Tajiia nodded her head. So Chancellor Wyckolt turned himself into a horse to run after Waggler. But as a horse, he couldn't see the way he normally did. He dropped the spell and then turned into a bird. He flapped his wings several times, but didn't rise in the air. Chancellor Adjutant came over and took the paper when Chancellor Wyckolt changed back. But the paper looked blank to him. What's all the urgency? Chancellor Wyckolt looked over the page and he pointed to the words. That part right there. This is a blank paper, stated Chancellor Adjutant. At that, Arshweya came over and took the page. She immediately wondered if Tajiia knew the spell before she had read part of her own story, or if coming in contact with the book and telling them telling her that they couldn't read it was how she said the spell now. She didn't think of the stack of books that Tajiia had recovered because she didn't know about those at this time. Chancellor Wyckolt changed into a bird again, and this time he flew off towards Waggler. Shaful handed her drawings to Arshweya, and she and several others followed behind Chancellor Wyckolt. They weren't flying very high up, but they were flying. Arshweya glanced around. I will stay back with anyone that wants the words to the spell to change to a bird. Everyone else may keep walking. Tajiia and several that were in her group, after all the rescues, kept walking. Most of them would change into different animals as they walked. Most of the rest of her group had already flown off. There were still a few that stayed with Arshweya from that original group. Akel was torn. She wanted to be with her daughter, but she wanted the lessons Arshweya was imparting, so she and the rescued prisoners stayed. The people from the other 4 groups didn't know what to do. So Artur motioned to them and said, You have choices. Fly or run to Waggler, walk with Tajiia as you practice, or sit with Arshweya. I will walk with Tajiia or sit with Arshweya, depending on which group is larger. That seemed to ease many minds, so most of the 4 groups sat with Arshweya. Rodcast was one that ran to catch up to Tajiia. His goat bleated and trotted along to follow behind. Balak caught up to Tajiia and asked her, I saw you look the direction we've come, and you looked a little startled. Shaful gave a great lesson today, stated Tajiia, but it is a little overwhelming trying to see all the walls can see. I had to disconnect, but I'm trying to figure out how to see from 2 points. Tajiia paused. I will need your help again when I figure out what to do. I'm not sure I understand, started Balak. Then he shook his head. I never understand at first, so just tell me what you want me to do. I will want you to guide me as I walk, stated Tajiia. Oh, okay, stated Balak. They continued walking. Chancellor Wyckoff flew over Wagler's body, and he panicked. So he fell, and he was instantly glad he had been close to the ground. He changed back and rushed to Wagler. "Please don't be dead. You didn't sting anyone, did you?" Wagler raised his head off the ground a little and looked at Chancellor Wyckoff. "No, I'm not dead. I'm dizzy. Being a bee, well, flying made things worse. So I sat on a flower. I tried to stay a bee as long as I could so everyone could see me. But I'm dizzy." Tajiia said you didn't know that after a bee stings someone, they die, stated Chancellor Wyckoff, as others landed around them. "No, I didn't know," stated Wagler. "She said you wanted to sting the soldiers or the dogs," accused Chancellor Wyckoff. "Oh, I did, but I couldn't adjust to the eyesight of the bees, so I couldn't sting anyone." Shuffle quickly put things together. "You were a bee? No wonder I didn't see you. I thought you would become a horse or a giraffe or something big." Several others muttered something about not being able to see a bee from so far away, even with the spell. Chancellor Wyckoff looked around at his group. "We need to be careful with these spells. I want everyone recording results. We will create a book and copy it several times so people can know the results and warnings." He shook his head to himself. Tajiia seems like this is all normal to her, but you're forgetting that she landed on her stomach on Artur's knee, put in Shuffle. "This idea of changing isn't so normal to her. Just she thinks of thousands, deeks, repercussions before she tries anything." "True," stated Chancellor Wyckoff. "Well, let's see if we can fly to the mountains and start setting things up. I think we might have all our people together and more soldiers than we know what to do with." They all changed to various nondescript birds, and they all flew towards the mountain. Several in Tajiia's group were finally able to fly, so they turned to Tajiia and said they were flying ahead. Raisler answered for Tajiia. "Yes, that's fine." The ones that stayed were mostly the ones that sat with Tajiia every evening. Ozzy, Alla, Balak, Carmise, Telka, and Tola. Geerton, the two witches that the archers also hit with poisoned arrows, Rodcast, his goat, the squirrel, the rabbit, and the three geese also stayed. The mentors had flown on. Normally, mentors didn't just leave their mentees, but they knew that Tajiia could protect their mentee better than they could. And Raisler had stayed back so he could advise Tajiia. After Arswea went over the instructions several times, and she gave the numbers in which, several people tried the different animals that Shuffle had drawn, since Shuffle had left her drawings with Arswea. Arswea looked around and saw a sheep, a squirrel, a bee, a leaf floating, a couple of trees, and several nondescript birds. She looked at Akel. Akel shrugged her shoulders. "I'm not sure what I want to try." "I tried a squirrel," stated Artur. "I think I want to try a dog. From the stories I heard, the soldiers seemed to fear the dogs." Arswea motioned for him to try, so he did. But he said the word for wolf instead of dog. Several people changed back to their normal form, and they backed away from the wolf. Arswea laughed behind her hand. "Oh, Artur, I'm sure the soldiers would be afraid of you, but they would not think you were a dog." Artur tried to look at himself by lifting a paw and looking down at it. "Why?" "That's another problem," stated Akel. "Tajiia would say wolves can't talk." "Wolf?" said Artur as he changed back. "I was a wolf? Not a dog?" Several witches and warlocks confirmed for him that he was a wolf. Artur then commented that perhaps he didn't know the witch language as well as he thought he did. They started walking toward the mountain, and Arswea told them if they wanted to be a bird and fly, that was fine. Or they could be a horse and run. Artur would remain behind and walk the whole way, or he would fly to be up with the last person. But no one needed to worry about being last. When the commanders realized the fights weren't just going to stop, they ordered several to step in. Breaking up the fights and resetting order took a long time. Arguments broke out and escalated until finally one commander yelled, "Silence! I don't care who is right or wrong. If I hear one word that I haven't asked for, I will kill you myself. Now listen carefully. Our enemies are the witches and warlocks we are chasing." He motioned with his hands. Then he continued speaking. "Our enemies are not the soldiers. Soldiers, dogs, huntsmen, handlers, wizards, look-alike warlocks, nor anyone else to your left or your right. You look ahead. We march ahead. And when we get to the mountain, we will comb every inch of it and rid ourselves of these nasty tricksters." Then the soldiers once again started marching, but the changes they would experience or witness along the way would spook them, and some of them realized they might not know who was a fellow soldier or who was a witch or warlock. Some felt they would still know the wizards from the castle because those wizards wore a golden bronze cloak and held a wand. Of course, that was assuming the magic they had come in contact with would not affect the wizards. Okay, writers, that is chapter 13. Not as much action as in the other chapters, but there's learning. As a teacher, I thought it was important to learn from my students as they learned from me. I thought that for many reasons that I won't go into here today. In today's chapter, Tajiia is learning from Shaful. But even as Shaful is teaching her spell, she's incorporating things she learned from Tajiia. Also, in this chapter, we visit a little of memory lane. It wasn't a flashback, but it was memory lane of when Tajiia's group visited the rabbits. We also know why it's so good that Auteur spoke when he tried to be a squirrel. Because Tajiia didn't let the soldiers who became dogs speak. So I'm weaving and connecting things like magic lessons and trials with air walls in order to have everything connected and everything woven together to have a purpose in the story. Now you can kind of see why we went into some of these things. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. Don't forget to write for Nano Wrimo today if you haven't done that yet. This is the third day. Join me Tuesday and we will talk about fictional pets or animals, including dragons. A person who read part of Mykela 1, White Witch Pending, thought I should talk about dragons because I have lots of dragons in that story. So I will talk about dragons. But I will round things out to include other pets or animals. So join me Friday for chapter 14 of Tajiia, Gathering. Visit my website, WritewithMykela.com, and read some character bios. Leave a comment on which characters are your favorites so far. I hope you're enjoying writing your stories as much as I am enjoying writing mine. Don't forget to share your stories by sending them to WritewithMykela@gmail.com. That's the chapter exchange part. When you share your chapters with me, no polishing required. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell so we can continue to write together. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your participation. If you know somebody who would like this video, then please share it with them. This is Mykela with Write with Mykela. Bye for now.